The powwow drum was beating when Dean Martin's plane made an emergency landing on the small airstrip outside Flagstaff, Arizona. It was October 1969, and Dean was flying from Los Angeles to a recording session in Nashville when engine trouble forced his pilot to set down at the nearest available runway. What Dean didn't expect was to find himself walking toward the sound of native voices singing in harmony, drawn by a rhythm that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. The Navajo Nation fair was in full swing, and Dean found himself at the edge of a gathering unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Hundreds of Native Americans in traditional dress moved in ancient dances around a central fire. The singing was unlike anything Dean had heard. Not performance, but prayer. Not entertainment, but ceremony. "You lost, sir?" Dean turned to see a young Navajo woman in her 20s, wearing a traditional velvet blouse and turquoise jewelry. Her English was perfect, but her eyes held a wariness that Dean recognized from his own childhood, the look of someone who'd learned not to trust outsiders too quickly. "My plane had engine trouble," Dean explained. The music drew me over." The woman studied his expensive suit and manicured hands. "You're not from around here?" "Los Angeles. I'm Dean Martin." She showed no recognition of the name. "I'm Sarah Begay. I teach at the school here." She gestured toward a cluster of modest buildings in the distance. "That music you're hearing? It's not for tourists. It's sacred." Dean felt embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Most people who wander over here want to take pictures or buy souvenirs. You just listened. That's unusual." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the dancers. Dean noticed that while the ceremony was beautiful and powerful, the surrounding community showed signs of profound poverty. Many of the children were wearing clothes that were clean but patched and worn. The school building Sarah had pointed to looked like it was barely standing. "That school where you teach," Dean said. "What's it like?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Underfunded, understaffed. The government provides just enough money to keep the doors open, but not enough to actually educate our children properly. Most of our kids are 3 grade levels behind the national average by the time they're 12. "Why?" "Because we're invisible," Sarah said bluntly. "The reservation system keeps us isolated, and as long as we're out of sight, we're out of mind. Our kids deserve the same education as children anywhere else, but they're getting textbooks from the 1950s and teachers who are burned out from trying to do impossible jobs with no resources." Dean watched a group of children playing nearby. They were bright-eyed and curious, but he could see what Sarah meant. Their school clothes were worn, their shoes had holes, and there was something in their posture that suggested they'd already learned that the world beyond their community didn't value them. "What would help?" Dean asked. "What would make the biggest difference?" Sarah looked at him carefully, as if trying to determine whether his question was genuine. "Everything. Books, computers, supplies, qualified teachers who want to be here instead of teachers who are here because they couldn't get jobs anywhere else. But mostly, respect. Programs that value our culture instead of trying to erase it." Dean's plane was repaired by the next morning, but something had changed in him during those 18 hours on the reservation. He'd seen poverty before, he'd grown up with it, but this was different. This was systematic neglect of an entire people, hidden away on reservations where most Americans never saw or thought about them. During the flight to Nashville, Dean couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Begay and her students. He'd made his fortune entertaining people, but what good was success if it didn't help solve problems like this? 2 weeks later, Dean made a quiet phone call to Dr. Robert Bergman, a physician who worked with the Indian Health Service and was known for his advocacy for Native communities. "Dr. Bergman, this is Dean Martin. I'd like to discuss something with you, but I need your word that this conversation stays private." "I'm listening, Mr. Martin." "I recently visited a school on the Navajo reservation. The conditions were unacceptable. I want to help, but I want to do it right. I don't want to be another rich white guy throwing money around and making assumptions about what people need." Dr. Bergman was quiet for a moment. "That's refreshingly honest, Mr. Martin. What kind of help are you thinking about?" "Whatever help the communities actually want. Educational support, cultural programs, infrastructure, but guided by Native voices, not my assumptions. That's going to require a long-term commitment and a willingness to listen more than you talk. I've got time and I've got ears." Over the next 6 months, Dean embarked on what he privately called his education. He visited reservations throughout the Southwest, always quietly, always as a listener rather than a celebrity making a grand entrance. He met with tribal councils, parents, teachers, and students. He learned about the complex relationship between tribal sovereignty and federal oversight, about the history of forced assimilation and cultural suppression, about the ongoing struggle to preserve native languages and traditions while preparing young people for success in the broader world. What Dean discovered was a series of interconnected crises that most Americans never saw. Schools with no libraries, children who had to walk miles to reach classrooms with leaking roofs and broken windows, teachers who cared deeply but were overwhelmed by impossible conditions. But Dean also discovered something else: incredible resilience, rich cultural traditions, and communities with clear visions for what they needed to succeed, if anyone would listen and provide support. The key, explained Tom Yazzie, a Navajo educator who became one of Dean's closest advisors, is that help has to come in partnership with us, not imposed on us. Too many programs come in with good intentions but end up doing more harm than good because they don't understand our values or our goals. Dean took this lesson to heart. Instead of creating his own programs, he began providing funding and support for Native-led initiatives that were already working or trying to get started. His first major investment was in Sarah Begay's school. Working through a foundation he'd quietly established, Dean funded a complete renovation of the building, new textbooks and computers, and most importantly, a program that integrated traditional Navajo teachings with standard curriculum. "We're not choosing between our culture and modern education," Sarah explained to Dean during one of his visits. "We're showing our children that they can succeed in both worlds, that being Navajo and being educated aren't contradictory." The program was revolutionary. Students learned math using traditional weaving patterns, studied science through traditional ecological knowledge, and studied history that included both Navajo oral traditions and standard American history. Test scores improved dramatically, but more importantly, students showed increased pride in their identity and confidence about their futures. Word of the program's success spread quietly through Indian country, and soon Dean was receiving requests for similar support from dozens of communities. He expanded his foundation's work to include language preservation programs, cultural centers, scholarship funds, and infrastructure improvements. One of Dean's most innovative initiatives was the Native Youth Leadership Program, which brought together young people from different tribes for intensive education and cultural exchange programs. These young leaders returned to their communities with new skills and expanded networks, creating a generation of advocates for their people. "You're not just funding schools," Tom Yazzie told Dean in 1972. "You're funding sovereignty. You're helping us build the capacity to solve our own problems and determine our own futures." Dean's approach was unusual for its time. Instead of paternalistic charity, he provided resources while insisting that Native communities maintain control over how those resources were used. Instead of demanding recognition or publicity, he kept his involvement as quiet as possible, understanding that outside attention often created more problems than it solved. The work was challenging in ways Dean hadn't expected. Federal bureaucracy made every project complicated. Some non-Native people criticized Dean for wasting money on reservations. Even within Native communities, there were disagreements about priorities and approaches. But Dean persevered, guided by what he called the Sarah Begay principle. Always listen first, always defer to community wisdom, and always remember that his job was to support, not to lead. The most emotional moment of Dean's involvement came in 1973, when he attended the high school graduation of the first class to go through the entire integrated program at Sarah's school. Every single graduate was going on to college or vocational training, a dramatic improvement from the previous 20% college attendance rate. Sarah Begay, now the school's principal, introduced Dean to the audience not as a celebrity, but as a friend who believed in our children when others didn't. One of the graduates, a young woman named Maria Yazzie, Tom's daughter, spoke about the impact of the program. "5 years ago, I was ashamed of being Navajo. The world outside our reservation told us that our traditions were primitive, that our language was worthless, that we had to choose between being Indian and being successful. This school taught us that was a lie. I'm going to Stanford University in the fall, and I'm going as a proud Navajo woman who speaks her language, knows her history, and understands that my culture is a strength, not a weakness." Dean, sitting in the back of the gymnasium, felt tears running down his face. This was what success looked like, not applause or awards, but young people who believed in themselves and their futures. By 1974, Dean's Foundation was supporting educational and cultural programs in over 40 Native communities across the Southwest. The model developed at Sarah's school was being adapted and implemented throughout Indian country, always with community leadership and always with respect for tribal sovereignty. Dean's involvement wasn't without controversy. Some critics accused him of playing Indian or appropriating Native culture. Some tribal members questioned his motives, wondering what a Hollywood entertainer really understood about their struggles. Dean addressed these concerns directly in a rare public statement he made in 1974. "I don't claim to understand the full experience of Native peoples. I'm not trying to save anyone or solve centuries of injustice single-handedly. I'm simply trying to support communities that know what they need, but lack the resources to achieve their goals. My role is to listen, provide support, and get out of the way." The statement was well received in Indian country, where Dean's actions over 5 years had proven his sincerity and respect for tribal sovereignty. The long-term impact of Dean's work extended far beyond the initial schools and programs. Many of the students who benefited from his support went on to become leaders in their communities, educators, lawyers, doctors, and tribal officials. They carried forward both the practical benefits of improved education and the deeper lesson that their culture was something to be proud of, not abandoned. Maria Yazzie, the Stanford graduate, became a federal judge specializing in tribal law. She credited the integrated education program with teaching her that she could succeed in the mainstream legal world while remaining deeply connected to her Navajo identity. Dean Martin showed us that we didn't have to choose between success and authenticity, she said in a 1995 interview. He supported programs that honored both our traditions and our aspirations. That's a lesson that shaped my entire career. Tom Yazzie became the first Native American to serve as superintendent of schools for the Bureau of Indian Education. He used that position to advocate for the kind of culturally integrated education that had been pioneered with Dean's support. Sarah Begay went on to found the Indigenous Education Institute, which trained teachers to work effectively in Native communities while respecting tribal cultures and values. The Institute's methods, originally developed in her small reservation school, are now used in Indigenous education programs around the world. Dean's involvement in Native education and cultural preservation remained largely private during his lifetime. When asked about his charitable work, he would mention other causes, but rarely spoke publicly about his work with tribal communities. The full extent of his involvement didn't become known until after his death in 1995, when his foundation's records were made public. The documents revealed that Dean had provided over $50 million in support to Native communities over 25 years, always following the principle of supporting community-led initiatives rather than imposing outside solutions. At Dean's memorial service in Los Angeles, a delegation of Native Americans attended to honor his memory. Sarah Begay, now in her 70s, spoke on their behalf. "The entertainment world remembers Dean Martin as a great performer. We remember him as a true ally, who understood that real support means listening to people, respecting their wisdom, and providing resources without demanding control. Dean never tried to be our spokesperson or our leader. He simply tried to be our friend and our supporter. He proved that solidarity doesn't require understanding everything about someone else's experience. It just requires respecting their right to define their own solutions and supporting their efforts to achieve them." Today, the Martin Foundation for Indigenous Education continues Dean's work, still guided by the principles he established: community leadership, cultural respect, and long-term commitment. The foundation has supported educational and cultural programs in over 200 Native communities across North America. In the Navajo Nation, there's a scholarship program named for Dean Martin that has sent over 3,000 students to college. But Dean's name isn't on any buildings or monuments. As he insisted during his lifetime, the focus remains on Native achievement, not on outside recognition. The most fitting tribute to Dean's work may be the words of Dr. Clarence Wesley, former president of the National Indian Education Association. Dean Martin understood something that many well-meaning people never grasp, that helping others isn't about making yourself feel good or look good. It's about making space for other people to achieve their own goals on their own terms. He provided resources and then got out of the way. That's the rarest and most valuable kind of support. The story of Dean Martin's work with Native American communities reminds us that true allyship isn't about speaking for others or solving their problems. It's about listening deeply, supporting community-led solutions, and understanding that real change happens when people have the resources they need to help themselves. Dean Martin entertained millions of people throughout his career, but his most important performance may have been learning to sit quietly in tribal council meetings, listening to community elders explain what their children needed to succeed, and then providing that support without fanfare or recognition. In a world where charity often centers the giver rather than the receiver, Dean Martin modeled a different approach, support that is guided by community wisdom, sustained over decades, and focused entirely on the success of the people being served. The powwow drum that first drew Dean to native country in 1969 continues to beat, and in communities across Indian country, young people are succeeding in ways their grandparents couldn't have imagined, thanks in part to an entertainer who understood that the most important audience is sometimes the one that teaches you to listen.